It's 1 a.m. Eastern Time on Friday, May 6th, and you're looking at a live view of Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral, Florida. The SpaceX Falcon9 rocket you see is approaching a 1:21 a.m. Eastern launch of JCSAT 14. Good morning or evening, depending on where you are tuning in from. Here at SpaceX headquarters in Hawthorne, California, we are getting ready for tonight's launch of JCSAT 14 to geosynchronous transfer orbit. My name is Kate Tice, and I am a process improvement engineer here at Mission Control Center in Hawthorne, California. Like I said, we're anticipating our liftoff of 1:21 a.m. Eastern Time. We're launching from Cape Canaveral tonight, and we are attempting a drone ship landing to Of Course I Still Love You, which is located a couple hundred miles off the coast of Florida. As usual, you can expect live shots from all across the rocket, all the way through payload deployment. We've got a lot going on, so let's get started.
Hi, I'm Michael Hammersley, a materials engineer for our avionics department. Behind me you can see the deep dark velvet, obscured somewhat by some beautiful smoke of the Florida night sky. There it is, clearing up again. This is the fourth flight of the Falcon 9 upgrade vehicle carrying JCSAT 14 towards a geostationary orbit. If you've joined us before, then you're very familiar with what this pad setup looks like. If not, you can see the Falcon 9 rocket, of course, in the middle. This is the first stage, which is what does the heavy lifting, getting the rocket to the edge of space. It will then separate from the second stage, and the first stage will continue on towards the drone ship, Of Course I Still Love You. The second stage, which is carrying the satellite in the top part here, this is the fairing, or the nose cone, just surrounding and protecting the satellite. The second stage will do two burns tonight. It will first get us into low Earth orbit, moving at about 8 kilometers per second. And it will then coast for about 15 minutes or so, do a second burn to kick it into a geostationary transfer orbit, which is what gets the satellite to its final position. Some other things you'll notice, this is the strong back, or the transporter erector. It supports the vehicle while it's standing before launch, and it also actually brings the vehicle out and tips it upright in preparation. You'll notice several lightning towers surrounding it. That's to protect it from errant lightning strikes, given how frequently Florida has storms, a lot of lightning. You can see the flame trench down here. Once the rocket starts lifting off, of course, the flame that it's producing is almost as long as the rocket itself is tall. And that gets channeled safely out towards the side. You'll also see that there's a little bit of what looks like smoke. That's totally normal. The rocket is just so cold. You'll notice a mission progress bar below that you can use to follow along with the important events, and a countdown timer at the top right of your screen to keep track of all of it.
Hey, I'm John Federspiel, a lead mechanical design engineer here at SpaceX, and I'm sure by now you know we're here to launch a really cool satellite into geostationary transfer orbit, or GTO. That satellite, of course, is JCSAT 14, which once fully operational will provide 4K television, as well as communication services for both the maritime and aviation industries. We're also today going to be continuing our experimental efforts to recover our first stage back on the drone ship, Of Course I Still Love You. And to put this effort into perspective, from July of 1950 right up until today, the 45th Space Wing at Cape Canaveral in Florida has supported well over 3,000 rocket launches. Of those launches, only 5 have ever attempted to recover and land the first stage of the rocket. Last December's Orbcom mission was the first to stick a landing back at Landing Zone 1 in Cape Canaveral, and we successfully test-fired that rocket a few weeks later. And about a month ago, we were also able to be the first ever to land a rocket on a drone ship in the Mid-Atlantic Ocean. That rocket is also in good shape, and our next step will be to test fire back at the Cape or at our rocket development facility in Texas. Now today we're doing something a bit more difficult. Given this mission's GTO destination, the first stage will be subject to some extreme velocities in re-entry heating, making a successful landing much more unlikely. But later on, we'll fill in exactly what this entails, as well as some Rocket Science 101. But let's check in with the other John for a quick status update.
Hello, I'm John Innsbrucker, Falcon 9 Principal Engineer. I'll be bringing you status updates from my desk here at the webcast headquarters in SpaceX headquarters here in Hawthorne, California. Now it's late in the evening here in California, but we still have the employees gathering for another Falcon 9 launch. Now currently we're deep into the launch auto sequence. That's where the computers are commanding the ground and the Falcon 9 vehicle hardware to get it ready for the planned on-time launch coming up in 15.5 minutes. Let's take a look at the status for the launch. The good news, the Falcon 9 team, very nominal countdown. They're working no significant issues right now. After yesterday's bad weather, we actually rolled out to the pad, used the opportunity to get out there early at about T-minus 25 hours. A couple hours after that, we were vertical on the launch pad. We've had a fairly quiet day, just getting the pad ready. We've gone into the actual power-on testing of the Falcon 9. We're now in propellant load. At T-minus 35 minutes, we began loading liquid oxygen into the first stage and kerosene fuel into both the first and second stages. The second stage is now complete with fuel load. We're also loading second stage liquid oxygen on now. So as I said, Falcon 9's counting down, working no issues. The JCSAT spacecraft team, they did their checkouts at about T-minus 10 hours while we were vertical earlier today. They've gone through their functional checks. They're right now in the middle of transferring to internal power. They started that at T-minus 30 minutes. We'll get an update on them when I give you the next status report. The range reports that they are ready to support. Safety systems, the tracking systems are ready. And finally on the weather, we've been looking at the ground level winds, but they're predicted to be good. We're checking the upper altitude, everything's still looking good. So at T-minus 14 minutes and counting, everything's looking good from the Cape.
The satellite we'll be launching will be providing television, including Ultra HD 4K TV, to millions of homes in the Asia-Pacific region. But not just TV. It'll also be providing communication for emergency services and disaster recovery efforts. The company that owns this satellite is SkyPerfect JSAT. They're the largest satellite operator in Asia. And those satellites are way out there. We're talking 90 times further from Earth than where the space station is. Now that's a huge distance. And it's amazing to think at what a technological marvel that is, to be able to beam a signal to that distance out in space and then back down to our homes. Now the signal weakens over that long journey to the satellite, but the satellite takes that signal, amplifies it, and then beams it back to Earth. This satellite has a unique look. It's definitely on the larger side, and it contains multiple antennae whose arrangement may look unusual at first, but those bends and turns are specifically designed for the Japanese landmass. Those patterns of bending focus the signal so that it's stronger over Japanese land, where people are, instead of having too much coverage over Japanese ocean, where people are not. Of course, television is great, but in emergency situations, seemingly simple services like making a phone call are essential. During the Great East Japan earthquake of 2011, there was significant damage to Japan's Earth-based communications infrastructure, including landlines. SkyPerfect JSAT provided satellite bandwidth to government and public organizations to put affected areas in touch with disaster response personnel. So there you have it, a quick snapshot of JCSAT 14 and many of its capabilities.
Okay, so we've got about 12 minutes until liftoff. As you can see, the crowd is growing behind me in anticipation of blastoff. Now, the crowd may not be as large as you may be used to seeing. That's because it is late at night here in California. Most of us are at homes with our families watching online, like yourself. So now let's go over a little bit about what we are launching and who we are launching for. Like Michael said, tonight's payload is JCSAT 14, a commercial communications and television broadcasting satellite for one of Asia's leading satellite operators, SkyPerfect JSAT. This satellite will service Asia, Russia, Oceania, and the Pacific Islands with Ultra HD 4K television programming and mobile communications for the maritime and aviation industries. That means in-home high-def streaming of your favorite movie or an important soccer playoff game, as well as communication for boats and airplanes in the Pacific. Included in that package, capabilities to deliver passenger cabin Wi-Fi and something I'm a big fan of, in-flight movies. This satellite has another job to do, though. In addition, in the event of a disaster, JCSAT 14 will also be able to provide communications for emergency services and disaster recovery. So if ground lines happen to be damaged in a natural disaster, this satellite will help connect people from the sky. Now we're sending it to geosynchronous transfer orbit. That's 35,786 kilometers away. In order for us to get it there, the vehicle requires a velocity of Mach 30. 37,000 kilometers per hour. That's about 13.5 times faster than a speeding bullet. So JFED will talk a little bit later about why we're sending it that far away. But like I said, this is a communication satellite, and it's going to be focusing on the Asia-Pac region. So if you think of my fist as Earth, we want the satellite to be able to match the rotation of Earth, so we have to send it that far away to do so. So we're at, looks like, T-minus 10, and we're really excited of the upcoming launch.
So on its way back to the drone ship, well, not back to the drone ship, the first stage has 3 systems to control its absolute position, as well as its yaw, pitch, and roll. And many thanks to Logan Sista, our fintegration specialist, for walking me through some of those. You've heard about the grid fins, which pop out like little T-Rex arms and rotate to control some of that motion. The engines as well, which can also rotate about the base, called gimbaling, to give it some directionality. And then you've got these 2 ACS pod thrusters. ACS stands for Attitude Control System. These 2 pods sit at the top of the inner stage. Each pod actually has 4 different thrusters. One points directly out. You have 2 pointing in either side, sort of into and away, or into the camera and away from the camera, and then one pointing down, the same direction as the engines. It's easy to see what the sideways ones do. They roll the vehicle, and the ones that point out are for flipping the vehicle after ascent. So it's continuing its parabolic arc. This ACS thruster will fire and it will rotate until it starts descending engines first. But why would it have a thruster pointed down the same direction as these much more powerful engines? And it's because during this ascent, it's basically in free fall at that point, which means it's in zero gravity, and just like astronauts that are floating around in zero gravity, the fuel inside the first stage is also floating around in zero gravity. So the liquid oxygen and RP1 kerosene propellants need to be kicked back to the engine so that they can be used. So as it's turned around, there are a couple fires or firing impulses that settle all that fuel down. And then as, of course, it descends, the grid fins work, and the landing engine burns will slow it down to land on the drone ship, which, again, fingers crossed, we hope we see later tonight.
We're at T-minus 8 minutes and 3 seconds, and we're continuing to count down for an on-time launch at 21 minutes after the hour. We're continuing to quickly step through the automated sequence, which controls both the ground systems and the Falcon 9. There's minimal involvement by the SpaceX launch team right now. The computers pretty much have control of the sequence. Now, T-minus 38 minutes before we came on the air, the team was polled. The 13 members were checked by the SpaceX launch conductor for their readiness to go into what we call the launch auto sequence. T-minus 35 minutes, we went into propellant loading. We have finished loading fuel onto the second stage. We are currently loading liquid oxygen onto both the first and second stages. That's going to continue up until about T-minus 2 minutes. We load liquid oxygen on as late as we can. We want to keep it as cold as possible, keep it densified to get the maximum performance out of the Falcon 9 engines and the Falcon 9 systems. So currently prop load continues to look good. There are a few events coming up that are significant. Just inside of 5.5 minutes, about 90 seconds from now, the guidance system will begin alignment. That's making sure that we know where we are and we're ready to head out into space. Just inside of T-minus 5 minutes, we'll pressurize the first and the second stages. That's to get ready to open the clamp arms around the second stage and begin retracting the strongback. That'll happen at about T-minus 3 minutes and 25 seconds. It takes a little while to see some motion on the screen, but then the strongback starts to pick up speed as it moves away. And then, of course, at T-minus 2 minutes, we finish prop load. The JCSAT spacecraft has gone internal. They're ready for launch. The ranges go. We're looking at ground level winds, but they're still good within a few miles an hour of the limit, so we think we're going to be good. So at T-minus 6 minutes, all systems continue to be good at the Cape.
In the late 17th century, Isaac Newton built off Johannes Kepler's planetary motion laws when he developed the law of universal gravitation. It's this same law which affects this tennis ball when I toss it back up in the air and it comes down, which we need to overcome to bring a spacecraft into orbit. Now, space is generally defined as being 100 kilometers away from the surface of the Earth, also known as the Kármán line. But if I simply threw this ball 100 kilometers up, it's going to come roaring back down in a few minutes. That's because at that distance, the Earth's gravity is still about 97% of what we feel right here on the surface. To get and stay in orbit, we need to not only go really high to get out of the Earth's atmosphere, but we also need to go really fast sideways. For geostationary transfer orbit missions, we can approach speeds of up to 37,000 kilometers per hour. And since kinetic energy is the square of velocity, this can require 100 times as much energy to achieve orbit than it does to achieve suborbit. Earth's gravity now acts as a centripetal force, turning our spacecraft around the Earth, which is also known as an orbit. Think of the spacecraft as this tennis ball, and this string as the Earth's gravity. When we're in orbit, the gravity is now spinning us around the center of the Earth, and we could stay up here almost indefinitely. Now, the two most common orbits that satellites reside in are low Earth orbit, which spans to about 2,000 kilometers away from the surface of the Earth, going from there to the geostationary orbit at 35,786 kilometers. That's our ultimate destination today for the satellite. And if I place a satellite with the right velocity at this distance, it will be in a stable orbit. By Newton's first law, the force due to Earth's gravity aligned with the center of the Earth will constantly change the satellite's direction, just like the tennis ball and string earlier, and we will stay up here, like I mentioned earlier as well, almost indefinitely. But bringing us right back here on Earth, we have begun the final preparation of the rocket, and you will see in a few moments here that strong back starting to retract as we are right leading up to the last few seconds of launch. At the T-minus 1 minute mark, our flight computers are going to enter into startup mode. At that moment, we're going to begin a series of final autonomous checks across the hundreds of sensors we have on the rocket, and that leads into the T-minus 3 second mark, where at the base of the rocket, look for a bright green flash come from the engines. That's kind of like our lighter starting a gas grill. This is what kicks the engines. Those 9 Merlin engines are going to fully ignite, reaching full thrust just 1 second before liftoff, where we have some hold-down clamps. Those clamps are going to check the force coming out of the rocket at that moment, and we are going to release the rocket. You're actually starting to see that strong back begin to pull away, and those final moments are occurring on the vehicle. After liftoff at the T-minus 0 mark, listen in, because 10 seconds into launch, you're going to hear one of our operators call out the phrase, starting pitch kick. This means that we are no longer going just straight up. We have started angling our rocket sideways to put JCSAT into orbit. Our GNC engineers, or Guidance, Navigation, and Controls, have optimized our trajectory to both minimize the atmospheric drag as well as the gravity losses, because until we reach that orbital velocity that I mentioned earlier, gravity is just pulling us back down to Earth and thus slowing us down. So now, with just a little over 2 minutes left, we at SpaceX invite you to listen into the final moments of our countdown sequence and make sure that you listen into those words starting pitch kick, because you'll know at that very moment that we are on our way into orbit.
Strong back fully retracted and locked out.
Stage 2 locked, secured for flight.
T-minus 2 minutes.
Falcon 9 is on internal power.
LD, verify, go for launch.
LD, go for launch. 6 seconds. Stage 1, stage 2, gravity, and secured for flight.
EC, verify, Falcon 9 is in startup.
Falcon 9's in startup. Stage 1, stage 2, pressing for flight.
T minus 30 seconds. T minus 20.
Falcon 9 secured. Flight pressures.
T minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Liftoff of the Falcon 9. JCSAT section 10.59 is secured back.
Falcon 9 power telemetry is nominal.
T plus 1 minute and 10 seconds. We've launched from Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral. We're waiting to hear the call out. We're going supersonic right now and passing through maximum dynamic pressure. Vehicle has completed the throttle down and throttle back up.
Stage 1 propulsion is nominal.
You heard the words and the cheering in the background. Propulsion is nominal, a phrase we love to hear at SpaceX.
Power telemetry remain nominal.
We're currently beginning.
MVAC chill has begun.
There's the call out for the chill in of the MVAC engine, just like we did before launch for the first stage engines. We're now chilling in the turbo pump on the second stage engine with liquid oxygen, getting it ready for ignition, coming up in just about 35 seconds. The next major event that we're going to hear is main engine cutoff. That will come up at about 2 minutes and 38 seconds. You can see the ground cameras following the Falcon 9. The cameras on the Falcon 9 will also be used, bringing us images back from space, and a great view looking up the back end of the main engine. We're going to listen in as we go to main engine cutoff and stage separation now.
There you can see the main engine. We got confirmation.
Our second stage has separated, and we have good ignition of our second stage as well. We'll be having a video of that for you in a second here. But right now, the good news is we successfully separated from our first stage, and that is back on its way to the drone shed, and we have a beautiful image of the engine valve for second stage.
Yeah, the first stage is actually continuing, because it's going so fast, it continues in this huge parabola, this ballistic trajectory, and out towards the drone ship in the middle of the Atlantic. It's quite a long ways. It goes up to about 200 kilometers in altitude before it starts descending again.
This is the same drone ship that we landed on not too long ago. Of course, I Still Love You, which, like we said earlier, is about a couple hundred miles off the coast of Florida.
Right, and let's not forget, of course, that view of the right side of that second stage, engine powering. And from the front end of the rocket there is the fairing separation. You can see the JCSAT there for a brief moment there as well. All these views are coming from cameras just like this one I have in my hand right here. It is literally this small. We at SpaceX design and build these in-house, like most of our avionics across the entire vehicle. Design, build, test. It's one of the things that we do really well here at SpaceX is vertically integrated.
Yep, we're making most of everything out of aluminum because it's very light. That's the reason we ditched the fairing, of course, is so that we're not carrying that excess mass towards orbit. It's just going to be slowing down unnecessarily.
Now that the second stage is it's going towards space where there is no atmosphere, we're able to deploy the fairing, as you just saw, because our payload JCSAT 14 no longer needs that protection from the friction created by the atmosphere.
So the second stage is going to continue to burn for a little while longer yet. It's going to keep pushing up that speed until it's about 8 kilometers per second to get it into that low Earth orbit. It will then pause for a little bit and allow it to sort of, I guess, be in a parking orbit in low Earth orbit, it's called. That's going to be in about 15 minutes of that coast period before it restarts to begin that second burn to get it to geosynchronous transfer orbit.
But right, let's take a quick pause right now to see how that orbit and progress is actually happening with John. He's been listening on the countdown nets.
T plus 5 minutes, everything continues to go nominal. You hear that call out occasionally, something that we love to hear, as I've said before at SpaceX. Give you an update on the Falcon 9 trajectory. Looking at the plot map on my monitor here, we're tracking down pretty much the middle of the predicted trajectory. Now we've headed somewhat due east out of Cape Canaveral. For our initial parking orbit, we don't really change the inclination of the orbit, so we'll shoot eastward. There will be a second burn a little bit later on that we plan to bring you in the webcast. That'll be the burn that takes us to the geosynchronous transfer orbit. The first burn is into the parking orbit. You heard the call there, stage 2 propulsion is nominal. We're looking at the MVAC-D engine. You can see it on the screen. We're monitoring the nozzle. You can see the red glow of the niobium alloy of the nozzle extension on the MVAC-D engine. That's the normal color. That's what we expect.
Power telemetry remain nominal.
Things continue to remain nominal still on both stages. We are also looking at chamber pressures on the engine. They're looking good and solid. We're watching how the turbo pump's working. We're looking at the avionics system, how power on the stage is. Everything right now on the Falcon 9 continues to look good as we power our way into that initial parking orbit. Major event about to come up that we're going to listen for is the entry burn of the first stage. We'll light 3 engines for about 15 seconds. Let's listen in for a minute and maybe we'll hear it.
Stage 1 entry burn has started.
There's the start of the burn. This will last for several more seconds. We'll shut it down, and then we'll wait for the landing burn and the second stage headed into orbit. We have shutdown of the landing burn. Let's turn it back down to the floor and see how things are going there.
Just in case if you've just joined us, we've had a great first ascent of the first stage, as well as a stage separation of first stage and second stage. Second stage, as you can see there on your screen, we had a great MVAC ignition, and second stage is now carrying JCSAT 14 out to geosynchronous transfer orbit. We're now waiting on, like John said, the first stage to come back and make an attempt on to landing on Of Course I Still Love You. And we just completed that landing burn, and we're going to be waiting.
The re-entry burn.
Excuse me, the re-entry burn. Thank you. And we're waiting for the landing burn, which I'm sure you'll hear the crowd around us start cheering whenever we have visual confirmation of that.
What makes this mission so difficult in particular, the geosynchronous transfer orbit missions, is that the re-entry, even after that re-entry burn, we're still moving twice as fast as we would for a typical low Earth orbit mission. We're entering the atmosphere at about 2 kilometers per second for this mission, instead of a more typical 1 kilometer per second for a low Earth orbit.
Right, and that landing burn is going to come up in about another 20 seconds or so, and keep in mind that those are going twice as fast. The velocity is the square, energy is the square of velocity, so 4 times as much energy is being imparted on that stage, and 8 times as much heating, which is why we said before this is going to be a very difficult mission for us, and we are not expecting a successful attempt at this time around.
Though we are
but
always
we're learning, we're always hoping. And you're hearing everyone cheer right now because coming into the drone tip, we will show you what we can right there, and that's a view from our drone tip in the Mid-Atlantic Ocean. And it looks like we have deep planning. We have some planning. This was a very, very challenging drone tip landing for us to pull off. As I said before, stage as well. That vehicle is going to coast for a bit before we do a second ignition.
Yeah, that coast is again to get us continuing our parking orbit so that we can begin that second burn to get JCSAT 14 directly where it should be, which is to say directly over Japanese and the Asia Pacific region, so it can do its communications jams. This box.
And it can do things like provide us amazing drone ship footage, like you see right there.
Yeah.
In case you missed the beginning part of our webcast, JCSAT 14 is a communication satellite for, is a communication satellite that will be focusing over the Asia Pacific region. So for it to be able to do its job, it's on its way. We put it into a good orbit. So far it's a really great evening or morning, depending on where you're joining us from.
So.
Honestly, everyone here is still extremely excited about looking at that face of the rocket, and we are as well. It looks in great condition. It's important to remember that we don't know the full state until we get our eyes on that vehicle and fully inspect it.
To be sure. So we're going to let you go while we're waiting for that coast period to end. Join us for the second part of the mission. We still do have to get that satellite to its geosynchronous transfer orbit, and that's going to involve a second burn and then the payload deploy itself. So we have a cool animation to show you what's going on.
Be sure to stick with us because we will be coming back to update you as the rest of the mission progresses.
Thanks for joining us.
This is John Insperker back with you at the Falcon 9 webcast desk here in our headquarters in Hawthorne, California. We are just past T plus 26 minutes and 15 seconds. We're getting ready for the relight of the second stage engine. Let's listen in. We have ignition. I'm hearing the team is happy that we're up at the correct power. Tank pressures are looking good. This burn will last about 1 minute. This is the geosynchronous transfer orbit burn. This will leave the JCSAT 14 spacecraft in the transfer orbit that takes it out to geosynchronous altitude. Continuing to watch the burn. Everything continues to go well. The engine's throttling down to maintain 5 Gs. And we have shutdown. Okay, we've got what looks like a good burn. We'll be back in just a minute with the folks downstairs to let you know how the orbit is. But let's go to the team downstairs as we get ready for spacecraft deploy.
As John said, we had a great second stage ignition, the second one, and a cutoff. Okay, so up to this point, we had a great first stage ascent, great stage separation. First stage came back down, landed on the drone ship in the Atlantic
Bonus
Ocean.
objective, but a good one.
And then second stage is taking JCSAT 14 out to geosynchronous transfer orbit.
So we've got a cool animation of what that actually looks like, because all of the vocabulary gets a little confusing. So we launch, first stage separates, heads back, the second stage continues. That was its first burn really quick, fairing deploy. And now, as it's circling in its parking orbit, the second burn begins, and it basically raises that orbit. So if it were to continue in that motion, it would turn into this giant egg-shaped orbit. But what the satellite does is it uses its thrusters to prevent that getting close to Earth again. So it circles the Earth at that geostationary distance.
And we do have confirmation at this moment that we are in a good orbit at this moment. We do have a good orbit at second stage, and we are preparing to deploy that payload in about another 3 minutes or so. Now, we do keep saying a lot around here that we're going to geostationary transfer orbit. That means that we put the satellite in trajectory so that it can eventually put itself in a geostationary orbit. You saw the full motion in that animation there, getting to the final geostationary orbit. We only put in a transfer orbit at that apogee. At the apogee of the orbit. The satellite itself will use its own thrusters to circularize that orbit for its final geostationary orbit.
The apogee meaning the farthest point away from the Earth in its orbit.
So there's a lot going on. We've talked about the first stage quite a bit. Let's talk about the second stage a little bit. So the first stage and second stage are very similar. The technologies that exist in both of these vehicles allow our manufacturing processes to be streamlined across both of them. But the second stage is more of the precision instrument. It's really getting the satellite into the exact right spot, because that is a very specific place in space that we have to get it to.
Well, right, like bringing it back to the orbits I talked about before, that first stage has to get us out of the atmosphere. The aerodynamic pressure on the vehicle is so great that that first stage is capable of putting out 1.71 million pounds of thrust at sea level. When we get into vacuum, it's a little bit more like 1.85 million pounds of thrust. And for comparison purposes, the second stage is putting out about 210,000 pounds of thrust in vacuum. So it gives a good perspective of the first stage doing all that heavy lifting. And that second stage, next time you watch a launch or you go back and rewatch this one, you'll notice that the second stage is really doing that speed maneuver to try and inject us into that precision orbit.
And that's what you see right there. That is the nozzle of our MVAC engine. That is obviously planet Earth rotating behind it. We got a nice sunlit view now. We didn't really have that a little while ago when we lifted off. But yeah, that's our second stage engine.
And even though the technology is wildly similar, or largely similar, between the two vehicles, or the first stage and the second stage, the fact that one has to operate in vacuum and the other in atmosphere reveal some of the larger differences. So this engine bell, for example, is a lot larger than the engine bells of the 9 engines on the first stage. And that's because in atmosphere, which is about 14.7 psi, once the engine plumes expand enough such that they reach 14.7 psi as well, you start to get serious turbulent effects. In vacuum, you don't have that pressure, and so you can have a longer engine bell to continue extracting work. Now we've got 5 seconds left before the second stage starts to rotate. And what that does is it allows the satellite to begin stabilizing for that when it deploys.
Yeah, it's a bit like, think of a much faster example. We think of like a rifling of a bullet. When you fire the bullet, to spin that bullet, to align it and make it go very straight. We are very, very slowly, and you'll start to see the vehicle rotate from that view, spinning up our second stage for the gyroscopic stabilization before we deploy our satellite, the JCSAT, from the forward end of that. And we are about to separate, and we have a good separation. You can see it leaving right there. Goodbye, JCSAT. It's been a great mission for you.
Have a great trip.
So at this moment in time, JCSAT itself is going to begin its on-orbit activation. You saw the animation a little bit earlier. It's going to pop out its solar rays as well as the antennas. And our second stage is going to remain in that area as well. We're going to do some safety maneuvering with that vehicle too.
So we still have to make sure that the satellite's behaving nominally, but that's really the bulk of our mission is getting it to that transfer orbit, that successful deployment.
Yeah, so it's been a great evening/morning for us so far. Just as a quick recap, we had a great ascent of the vehicle, great stage separation and return of the first stage back at, of course, I Still Love You, sitting nice and pretty on top of our autonomous spaceport drone ship there. And then obviously you just saw a great payload deployment of JCSAT 14.
Yeah, we'd like to thank our customer, the whole Sky Perfect JSAT Corporation, our partners at the Air Force and the FAA. We'd also definitely like to thank you, the audience, for joining us again. We definitely enjoy doing these up here. We definitely enjoy sharing these experiences with you.
Follow us at SpaceX.com or our social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you're interested in working here as well, look at SpaceX.com/careers.
So once again, thank you for joining our webcast. And so say we all, have a good night.